Next assembly we're going to discuss under the BAVCO name is the Model 10. The Model 10 was produced in sizes 1 through 4 inch. BAVCO produced the Model 10 when they had the Model 6 in the larger sizes, and they needed something to get into the smaller ranges. And they had some different changes in this. It was kind of a new generation after the Model 6 of some things they were trying to produce. Rubber parts are no longer available, and hardware parts are either. So it's kind of a footnote valve produced from about 1958 to about 1970, the BAVCO Model 10. And here's a 1-inch assembly. And it's funny that the 1-inch assembly would have an 1.5 inch outlet check on the outside. The second check was simply a little spring-loaded poppet check like this, which was fairly standard check mechanism like we saw in the 6C series. What was unique was the check valve. The check valve on this version was a diaphragm check. Notice it had the one bolt hold the disc into the disc holder, but we also had two diaphragms that augmented the check in its guiding mechanisms that went up and down. So unlike the standard poppet check, which was just up and down, the Model 10 utilized the diaphragm check. The relief valve utilized the same parts as the 6C. This was the first interjection of the relief valve that we see in the 6C. Because again, remember at this time they were making the Model 6, but this was the first generation of the 6C. You can see by the lock nut here and the same type of mechanism that was in there. So this is the Model 10. Parts are no longer available, but I wanted you to see what one looked like, knowing that the first check was unique with the diaphragm check and the first interjection of the relief valve from the 6C version. This is the Model 10. The BAVCO Model 12 is a reduced pressure principal assembly, produced only in size 3/4 inch. Again, produced when BAVCO was only making the Model 6 and the Model 10. This was for the very small sizes. BAVCO tended to be a company that was more interested in service protection, meaning the larger assemblies, which their Model 6 was basically made for. And as plumbing codes finally started getting involved in some of the installation of assemblies, they wanted a smaller assembly for smaller point of service applications, and the Model 12 came about. Model 12, no more parts are available. Production began from about 1960 till about 1975. Let's go ahead and see what the Model 12 looks like. First unique thing you'll notice that the inlet right here and the outlet right here are on two different horizontal planes. In other words, this one's higher, this one's lower. That if you had to repipe this assembly, replace this assembly, it was not a straight shot piping coming in and out. It came in, dropped down, and went to the side. Obviously a lot of turbulences that flew through this, but when you went to replace it, because there are no more repair parts available for this assembly, so if you do see one, you are going to have to replace it. It was a two-piece body. There was unions on both sides, had to be taken apart. Second check was very similar to what we saw in the Model 10 with a small little poppet style check. What was unique on the Model 12 had to do more about the check and the relief, first check and the relief valve. First of all, it was a one-piece unit. It had a diaphragm check like the Model 10. Here was my first check disc. There was my relief valve disc on the bottom. But since there are no more rubber repair parts available, this will be a footnote in history, the BAVCO Model 12. The BAVCO Model 14 was produced in sizes 3/4 through 6 inch. The Model 14 was produced from approximately 1968 to about 1975. There was a bronze body version in 3/4 through 4 inch, and there was a cast iron body version in the larger 6-inch sizes. The Model 14 was a revision of some of the earlier models, the Model 6C, and some changes that they had produced, trying it out as an interim model. Wasn't produced for a very long time, but rubber parts are no longer available for the Model 14. Hardware parts also no longer available. They had a double check version with the same type check mechanisms called the Model F72. Again, Hersey was giving us over the years same basic check instruction in their double checks as the RP version. So the F72 was the double check, Model 14 being the reduced pressure principal assembly. And here's a picture of the Model 14 to give you an idea what it looked like on the outside. Here's a 3-inch size that's shown. As again, no more parts are available. But let's go ahead and take one apart and see what it looked like inside. This is a 3/4 version. The relief valve underneath, remember in the Model 10 we started seeing the first interjection of the relief valve from the 6C. In this particular version, this is the first interjection of the Model 6CM relief valve. So while they were developing this valve, it was kind of a prototype for running the 6CM, where we had the relief valves that slided into a relief valve housing as opposed to two seats that had to thread together. What was unique about the Model 14 RP version and the F72 double check version was the checks. It was something that we see rather commonly today, but back then was kind of new. It's a cam-operated check. In other words, the check opened like this, so that the operation of water coming from the bottom caused the check to open, compressing a spring through the back side. For a proper repair of this unit, we had to release the spring tension, which would allow us to drive out the pin, remove the cam arm, tilt it back to go ahead and replace our disc holder. So, like this, and then we could go ahead and replace our check disc. But anyway, the Model 14, first interjection of the 6 cm relief valve, first where we've seen that tilt action cam check, parts no longer available, kind of left to a footnote in history, and that's the Model 14. The next assembly we're going to discuss is the Hersey FRP and the FRP Roman numeral II series of reduced pressure principle backflow prevention assemblies produced in sizes 3/4 through 2. Notice there's an FRP and a Roman numeral FRP2. FRP2 is by far the most common assembly. It was produced from about 1975 to about 2004, and that first couple of years, 75, 76-ish, they had what was called the model FRP, no Roman numeral II, which was the original design, and it was changed rather quickly to the FRP2 design of assembly. It was a bronze body construction, had a modular check assembly, modular relief valves. Here's what the check assemblies, again, modular in construction, came out of the body for the repair, taking the check assemblies apart, replace the rubber parts, the relief valve, also modular. Removing the relief valve cover allowed for the relief valve stem to come out for rebuilding. Relief valve seat needed a special tool to replace it. There's a picture of what that special tool looked like. The FRP and FRP2, the main designation had to be with the relief valve. The checks were the same construction. The FRP2 series had a round-shaped diaphragm on that particular assembly. The model FRP had a more square-shaped diaphragm, and the relief valve was mounted underneath the check body, but not low enough for proper discharge of that particular assembly. Here's what the model FRP series looked like. Again, this was in the 3/4 and 1 inch size. With the FRP2, the relief valve was lowered so that it would have the ability to drain the body out when the back pressure, back siphonage test was changed. But the model FRP2 production has been discontinued. Rubber repair parts are still available and still in production. Hardware parts have been discontinued and limited to stock on hands. Here's what the FRP2 looks like. Inlet here, first check, second check, relief valve down below here. This is an assembly that would have to be identified physically a lot of times because the serial number tag was a small little brass piece that sat underneath the test cock. And anytime anybody changed the test cock, they'd put new test cocks on, and sometimes this would fall off, but that's where the tag is supposed to be. But anyway, this is the FRP Roman numeral II. This is the FRP without the Roman numeral II. A little bit different. The check assemblies look exactly the same, and actually they were. The check parts were interchangeable. What was different was the relief valves. If you'll notice that the relief valve on the FRP series utilized basically a square-shaped diaphragm. There were some other idiosyncrasies, and the FRP2 utilized a round-shaped diaphragm. So it was kind of easy to tell the difference between a square diaphragm and a round diaphragm. And there were some other changes, but those were the main visual ones that you could tell the difference. If you have the old FRP, not Roman numeral II, rubber parts are no longer available. I mean FRP. If you have the FRP2 version, rubber parts are still available. No hardware parts, but just rubber repair parts. So let's go ahead and see what the looks like. Let's start with the checks. The check assemblies are modular. This being a 3/4, I have a 2 inch in my hand, but you can see it bigger, so let's see what it looks like. This is what the check assembly looks when it comes out of the body, sealed by an O-ring underneath. The O-ring sits right under here, underneath the check assembly. Let's go ahead and take the check assembly apart. This being a 2 inch, there are 4. The 3/4 inch has 3 screws. Number of screws around there. Taking it apart, however many it is, 3 or 4, go ahead and loosen the screws. Once you loosen the screws, there will be spring tension underneath, so hang on to it, especially on the first check of the FRP2. Spring retainer, spring, disc holder, and check seat. Now, the check seat has 4 posts around the side. This is a side-guided check mechanism. We've talked about several kinds of checks today, poppet checks, double check, the hinge check. This one is guided on the sides of that disc holder. As you can see here, one of the posts is missing. That's very important because obviously if this check is moving around through its travel, it has the ability to move back and forth, would cause that assembly to not work well. Anyway, hardware parts are no longer available. If you had this situation, you would have to replace the entire assembly. But assuming you had all 4 pegs, assuming that one screw changes the disc into the disc holder, reassembly would be just this for the normal repair. But the trouble is, you never know when you're going to have a normal repair and when you're going to have an abnormal repair. So it's important to know what it's supposed to look like. Anyway, reassembling of the check valve, replace my check disc, replace my mounting O-ring, have it ready to go back into the body. Now my relief valve stem, which again, to remind you what the relief valve looked like down here, relief valve cover being round, this being a 3/4 on your left. Here's a 2-inch relief valve stem, which is a little bigger to see on your right. Take the relief valve stem, comes out in one piece. The relief valve seat stays captured inside the body and does not have to be replaced for the average repair, but the relief valve seat was replaceable. Special tool was needed to replace the seat. There were 2 versions of the relief valve stem, and the way you could tell the difference was looking through the back side. On the oldest model, it was relatively shallow right here. On the newer generation, it was very deep inside here where that stem comes through the back side. So this hexagonal shape here, the round shape, this will be the newer style, this will be the older style. Let's go ahead and take the old style apart first. One screw holds the relief valve stem together, will release spring tension as it comes off. We have our assembly housing our spacer O-ring, our assembly bolt, our relief valve disc, our upper relief valve stem, our stationary spacer, this very important unusual looking piece of rubber called a quad ring, a relief valve spring, upper diaphragm plate, diaphragm, lower diaphragm plate. Let's take the new one apart, the newer version, and take a look and see what's different. Same O-ring that we saw on the older version. Same when we take the one screw apart, we'll see release of the relief valve spring, our assembly bolt and an RV disc retainer, guide, relief valve stem, relief valve spring, quad ring, upper diaphragm plate, diaphragm, and lower diaphragm plate. And this is the main difference between the 2 types of stems, as you see right here. The older version, they took this plastic, and the plastic that they utilize here is a plastic called glass-filled Naril. Relatively brittle, relatively hard plastic. And where the screw protrudes down through the top was simply threaded into that plastic. The trouble was, as you go to compress that spring and assemble that relief valve, it was relatively easy to strip that screw. And actually, you'd go and tighten it in, and you didn't know you stripped it until the first time the relief valve cycled back and forth, and then this relief valve stem would come apart. So to minimize the relief valve disassembling in the water passageway or stripping that screw, in the later model, what they did is they put a brass grommet in the center of the stem. This now made it more durable, something that would not strip. So the old version was just a tapped piece of plastic, like you see on your right, and on the left is the newer version, which has the brass grommet in it so that it wouldn't strip. Whichever version you had, the rubber parts would be the same. Reassembling is going to be the reverse. We're going to have our lower diaphragm plate, upper diaphragm plate. And now for this piece that I called a quad ring. And what it is, it's not an O-ring like a round circle, but it's like an X shape. So unfortunately, it is very, very important as we put it in that we have to put it in. So it's like a square O-ring in essence. And like an O-ring, it has to be lubricated, but unlike an O-ring, we can't slide it into place. We have to place it in place. And that's why this stem is split in half. Some of the other designs that we've seen where the O-ring just slid over the stem and slid into the holder, you can't do that with a quad ring because of that shape. It has to be placed in there and then put back together. So once you've got that in place, properly lubricated, relief valve spring, our guide, upper stem, relief valve disc, assembly bolt, and disc retainer. Compress my relief valve spring, catch the screw. O-ring. Reassembling. Relief valve stem is just going to press in from the side. relief valve cover over the outside. Relief valve sensing line is going to be internal, so we want to make sure that the hole through the diaphragm is properly placed. Check assemblies, O-ring on the bottom, mount in place. It's either going to be 3 or 4 screws depending on the side, how it's mounted inside the body. So the FRP version has the square, FRP2 has the round diaphragm, FDC is the double check version without the relief valve, just looking at the 2 checks. So this is our model FRP and model FRP2.